There are famous people, and then there are people who seem to escape the category of human fame entirely, people who don't just enter culture, but alter it. Michael Jackson was one of those figures. He did not feel like a celebrity in the ordinary sense. He felt like an event, a disturbance, a signal so powerful that millions of strangers could sense it before he even moved. And for decades, people tried to explain that strange force with the easiest words they had: genius, obsession, madness, perfectionism, eccentricity. But those words never fully solved the mystery because they described what the world saw, not what was happening underneath it. That is why the title question matters more than it first appears. What made Michael Jackson's brain different from everyone else was never just a sensational theory about a superstar. It was a real puzzle hiding inside one of the most watched lives in modern history. Because when a person can hear songs before they exist, command a stadium with silence, and create performances so precise they seem less rehearsed than downloaded from somewhere beyond ordinary thought, sooner or later a deeper question begins to form. Was this only talent, or was his mind functioning in a way most people never experience? For a long time, the public thought they already knew the answer. Michael was a prodigy, yes, but also an extreme personality, a man so driven by fame and fantasy that he became his own myth. The headlines trained people to look at the masks, the rumors, the surgeries, the contradictions. And once that happened, everything about him got folded into spectacle. His discipline became weirdness. His sensitivity became fragility. His unusual habits became proof that he was somehow detached from reality. The world stared so hard at the surface that almost nobody noticed the far more unsettling possibility beneath it. Maybe his mind was not simply unstable. Maybe it was organized differently. Maybe the same brain that made him unforgettable also made ordinary life almost impossible. That possibility becomes even more haunting when you realize something else. The medical evidence after his death did not reveal some monstrous secret hidden in his body. The coroner's findings described a man whose overall health, apart from the fatal drug intoxication and a long list of visible scars and medical traces, did not show some obvious anatomical defect that explained the life he had lived. One doctor testified there was nothing anatomically wrong that would have naturally led to premature death. In other words, the answer was never going to be found in a simple horror story autopsy. The real difference was subtler than that and far more tragic. CNN, The Guardian. And that is where the real story begins. Because Michael Jackson left behind a contradiction so extreme, it almost refuses to fit into one life. On one side was the artist who could walk into a room and seem to generate gravity. A child who became a virtuoso before most children understand what work is. A performer who could turn timing into electricity and make rhythm feel physical. A creator who, according to accounts repeated for years by people who worked around him, often built songs in his head, and then used his voice to demonstrate entire musical ideas to the people in the studio. Not just melody, but layers, textures, movement, shape. That is not how most people think. That is not even how most gifted musicians think. OUP blog. On the other side was the man who seemed to spend much of his life trying to outrun himself. The deeper his fame grew, the stranger the distance became between the public image and the private person. He admitted he felt safe on stage and afraid in crowds. He spoke again and again about the childhood he never had, about seeing other children play while he worked. He built fantasies of innocence because his real innocence had been spent too early. The world mocked that longing as immaturity, but almost nobody stopped to ask what it means when a child's brain is shaped from the beginning by performance, pressure, fear, and applause. Biography. That question matters because science has changed. For years, people spoke about creativity like a divine fog, something magical but vague. Trauma was also described in vague language, as if pain were just an emotional bruise that time could smooth over. But neuroscience has become much less sentimental. Researchers now know that intense musical training can physically reshape the brain's auditory and motor systems, sharpen attention, memory, and timing, and strengthen the networks involved in integrating sound, movement, and prediction. They also know that childhood trauma can alter stress systems, emotional regulation, and the brain's response to threat, connection, and reward. So when we look at Michael Jackson now, we are not forced to choose between genius and suffering. We can finally see that the same brain can be shaped by both. PMC, PMC, NCBI. But that was only part of the story. Because musical brilliance alone does not explain Michael Jackson. History is full of great musicians, even child prodigies, who never produced that eerie sense people had around him. They admired others. They studied others. They paid for tickets to see others. But with Michael, people fainted before the music even began. Crowds screamed at the sight of stillness. It was as if he understood not just song, but anticipation itself. Not just rhythm, but the brain's hunger for release. He could delay a movement by a fraction of a second and trigger a detonation. He could whisper and make it feel louder than a scream. Somewhere in that ability was a clue. He was not only making music, he was playing the nervous systems of millions of people like an instrument. And strangely, the science points in that direction too. Modern research suggests creativity is not housed in one magical brain region or in some cartoon idea of a right brain genius. Instead, creative thought emerges from dynamic cooperation between large-scale networks. One network generates internal material, drawing from memory, imagination, emotion, association. Another evaluates, edits, shapes, restrains, and refines. In ordinary life, these systems often compete. In highly creative minds, they can cooperate with unusual efficiency. That matters when thinking about Michael Jackson, because what made him so shocking was not raw spontaneity alone, and not discipline alone, but the terrifying marriage of both. He seemed able to receive ideas with emotional immediacy and then sculpt them with ruthless control. PMC, PubMed Central, OUP blog, yet almost nobody noticed what that combination might cost. To the public, he became a story about excess, a cautionary tale, a tabloid maze, a face changing in front of the whole world, a superstar who seemed to drift further from normal life every year. But public perception can become a trap, especially when it rewards the simplest explanation. If a person is different, the crowd prefers one label. If he is brilliant, call him gifted. If he is suffering, call him broken. If he is both, call him bizarre. Michael Jackson spent years buried under that third word. And the tragedy is that it allowed people to miss the hidden architecture of the whole story. The difference in Michael Jackson's brain may not have been a visible deformity or a single rare condition. It may have been something more extraordinary and more devastating. A brain trained with abnormal intensity from early childhood to merge sound, movement, memory, and emotion at a near superhuman level, while being damaged at the same time by fear, deprivation, and isolation. A brain that could generate wonder for the world, yet struggle to feel safe inside itself. What happened next made the mystery even deeper. Because once you stop looking at Michael Jackson as a caricature and start looking at him as a nervous system shaped by impossible conditions, nearly every contradiction in his life begins to change meaning. Part 2. Before the science caught up, the world had already written its verdict. Michael Jackson was presented as a puzzle with an easy answer. He was simply too much, too famous, too strange, too damaged, too artificial. The public learned to look at him through fragments: the child star, the moonwalker, the recluse, the tabloid obsession, the man whose face changed, the man who seemed more comfortable in performance than in ordinary life. Each fragment was true in some narrow sense, but together they produced something misleading. They turned a complicated human being into a spectacle of surfaces. And once that version hardened, every mystery around him got interpreted in the least generous way possible. If he was shy, it became suspicious. If he was childlike, it became absurd. If he was private, it became evidence that something was being hidden. If he reinvented himself, it was treated as pure vanity, rather than part of a deeper struggle with identity and control. Even his creative intensity was often reduced to obsessive behavior, as though perfectionism explained everything. But perfectionism does not explain how someone hears layers of music before they are played. It does not explain why timing came to him like instinct. And it certainly does not explain why he seemed to move through life like a person whose inner world was always louder than the outer one. The media machine helped make that misunderstanding permanent. As one major profile later observed, much of the scrutiny directed at Michael Jackson's so-called freakishness came from people who showed little appreciation for the scale of his musical genius and little respect for the work itself. Instead of asking what kind of inner life could produce such art, they became fixated on the easier theater of eccentricity, the animals, the rumors, the oxygen chamber story, the endless fascination with his body, his voice, his face. The world was not really trying to understand him, it was feeding on him. Rolling Stone. That distortion matters because public assumptions can become emotional facts. They start to feel more real than evidence. In Michael's case, one assumption became especially powerful, that his strangeness caused his genius. It is a seductive story. The weirder he seemed, the more people felt justified in treating his brilliance as the byproduct of some abnormal, almost inhuman condition. But the truth may be far more uncomfortable. His genius and his suffering were not separate. They were entangled. The same developmental forces that sharpened his artistry may also have destabilized his sense of self. To understand why, you have to go back to the image Michael returned to again and again throughout his life: other children playing while he worked. He described seeing them from the recording studio and feeling a deep ache that never really left him. That memory was not trivial nostalgia. It was a clue. Most children build themselves in stages through ordinary repetition: play, social risk, boredom, experimentation, failure, privacy, mischief, emotional safety. Michael built himself under evaluation. Rehearsal replaced play. Applause replaced ordinary feedback. Fear and discipline stood where spontaneity should have been. He later wrote that if you messed up, you got hit. That is not just a harsh upbringing. That is a nervous system being taught that performance and survival belong to the same sentence. Biography and science has become painfully clear about what that can do. Reviews of childhood trauma show that repeated stress during development can chronically activate the brain's threat and stress systems, influencing the amygdala, hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and the body's hormonal response to danger. Over time, this can affect emotion regulation, vigilance, memory, executive function, and the basic sense of safety inside relationships and social life. In simple language, the child does not just remember fear, the child learns the world through it. PMC, NCBI, PMC, PubMed Central. Now place that beside a second fact. Musical training, especially when it begins very early, can strengthen auditory sensitivity, timing, motor coordination, memory, attention, and the coupling between hearing and movement. It can literally help tune the brain for complex cognitive functions. In children, those effects may be strongest during sensitive developmental periods. So in Michael Jackson's case, the conditions were extreme in both directions at once. He was not just trained early, he was saturated in performance. He was not simply practicing songs. He was living inside a continuous sensory and emotional rehearsal from the time most children are still figuring out how to be alone in a room. PMCOUP blog. That combination helps explain something the world always sensed, but rarely understood. Michael did not perform like a person copying technique. He performed like someone whose body had become a musical translator. Rhythm did not seem external to him. It seemed built into his reflexes. When he danced, sound looked visible. When he paused, silence became rhythm too. The crowd felt it because he was not simply keeping time. He was controlling expectation, tension, and release with microscopic precision. That kind of command does not emerge from talent alone. It emerges when listening, movement, emotional intuition, and learned control fuse so deeply they stop feeling separate. But there was another layer almost nobody talked about. Accounts of his songwriting often described a creator who heard songs internally before the studio gave them physical form. The Oxford piece on Michael Jackson's creativity points to how he would compose with his voice, singing instrumental parts and arrangements that others then helped realize. That detail sounds charming until you consider what it implies. Many people get melodies stuck in their heads, but research on involuntary musical imagery shows that internal music can become vivid, repetitive, and strikingly faithful to real sound. Scientists call it INMI, though most people know it as an earworm. In ordinary people, it arrives in fragments. In highly musical minds, especially ones shaped by years of training and exposure, internal sound can become far richer and more organized. OUP blog PubMed Central. And suddenly something about Michael Jackson starts to look less mythical and more neurologically plausible. He may have lived in unusually dense contact with music inside his own mind, not metaphorically, functionally, not just inspiration, but continuous access to structured internal sound tied to movement, emotion, and memory. That would help explain why he could seem to pull finished moments from nowhere, why entire performances felt pre-felt before they were performed, why he once seemed to know what the audience would feel before the audience felt it. But if that is true, it raises a darker question. What happens when a brain this sensitive is not protected? What happens when the same person whose internal world is already crowded by rhythm, imagery, perfection, and expectation is also carrying unresolved fear, fame beyond scale, chronic scrutiny, and the inability to disappear? The public saw the spectacle of Michael Jackson's later life and assumed excess had made him fragile. The evidence suggests something more disturbing. Fragility may have been there from the beginning, hidden beneath impossible output. Because hidden beneath all of this was something else entirely. The world kept trying to decide whether Michael Jackson was authentic or constructed, innocent or manipulative, childlike or calculating, broken or brilliant. But the brain does not divide human beings into neat moral categories. It records, it adapts, it compensates, it survives. And when survival and performance are welded together early enough, the adult that emerges can look incomprehensible from the outside. The answer had been visible all along. People just kept looking in the wrong place. They looked at his face, when they should have looked at developmental pressure. They looked at his fame, when they should have looked at nervous system overload. They looked at his strangeness, when they should have looked at the architecture of genius under stress. And once those pieces begin to align, one possibility becomes difficult to avoid. Michael Jackson may not have been different because he escaped human limits. He may have been different because he reached certain heights by paying with the parts of a life that normally keep a person whole. And that realization changes everything, because now the mystery is no longer just how he became Michael Jackson. The mystery is what it felt like, inside that brain, to be him. Part 3. Imagine hearing more than other people hear, not louder but deeper, not just melody but shape, not just rhythm but momentum. Imagine a mind in which music does not arrive as decoration but as architecture, where a bass line is not an accessory beneath a song but a physical current, where a drum pattern has direction, where a pause can hold more force than a burst of sound. This is the closest science can come to making sense of the stories that surrounded Michael Jackson's creative process, because the old language of genius is too vague. It flatters, but it explains nothing. The better explanation begins with what researchers now understand about the musical brain. Musical training does not merely teach a person how to perform. It changes how the brain coordinates listening, prediction, fine movement, memory, and emotional timing. Studies have found stronger auditory motor integration, improvements in executive function, sharpened temporal attention, and evidence that early musical training can tune the brain for broader cognitive and social functions. That does not mean every trained child becomes Michael Jackson. It means his brain was developing inside the exact kind of environment capable of amplifying those systems to extraordinary levels, PMC. But Michael's case appears to have gone beyond technical development. The reports of him composing by singing parts, building songs internally, and shaping them through vocal demonstration suggest a mind with exceptional auditory imagery. In simple terms, he may have been able to hear music inside himself with an unusual degree of detail and control. Research into involuntary musical imagery shows that internally heard music can be surprisingly vivid and stubbornly persistent, especially in people with strong musical memory and repeated exposure. Most people know the annoyance of a chorus looping in their minds. Michael Jackson may have lived in a far more advanced version of that phenomenon, where internal music was not random debris, but raw material. PubMed Central OUP blog. If that sounds romantic, it shouldn't, because there is something overwhelming hidden inside that gift. A mind that is constantly generating, replaying, refining, and emotionally loading music is not necessarily a peaceful place to live, especially if the person inhabiting that mind is also driven by perfection. Creativity researchers now describe creative thought as a dynamic cooperation between large-scale networks in the brain. One generates self-produced ideas, associations, images, emotional material. Another evaluates those ideas, edits them, and forces them into shape. In the most creative people, these systems can cooperate unusually well. But such cooperation can also create enormous internal pressure because the mind is producing and judging itself at the same time. PMC, PubMed Central. And nobody watching Michael Jackson in his prime could miss the evidence of that pressure. His work was not loose brilliance. It was sculpted brilliance. The vocals were layered obsessively. The grooves were exact. The dance was explosive, yet tightly rationed. Nothing looked accidental, even when it felt ecstatic. That paradox is one of the strongest clues to what made his brain different. He was not only imaginative, he was internally synchronized. He could generate emotional material and then impose precision on it without draining it of feeling. That is one reason the performances still feel alive decades later. They are controlled without feeling dead. But that same capacity may have created a terrible vulnerability, because the more a person depends on precision to feel right, the harder it becomes to tolerate disorder. And Michael Jackson's life, especially later in life, was saturated with disorder. The body changing under medical intervention, the sleep problems, the pressure to return, reinvent, deliver, surpass, the inability to be ordinary in public, the residue of earlier pain, the noise of accusation and surveillance. He was expected to produce transcendence while living in chaos. The record after his death sharpened that contradiction in a brutal way. The coroner's work and later trial testimony pointed not to some dramatic natural disease that had been destroying him from the inside, but to a man with visible scars of surgeries and medical history, vitiligo, scalp tattooing to blend with wigs, and a fatal dependence on dangerous pharmacological solutions for sleep. One physician testified that, apart from the circumstances of his death, there was no anatomical finding suggesting he could not have lived a normal lifespan. That is haunting, because it means the body did not simply fail on its own. The life around it did. CNN, The Guardian. And when you trace the line backward, another wound appears. The Pepsi accident in 1984, where his hair caught fire during a commercial shoot, became one of those moments people mention quickly and move past. But the aftermath mattered. Michael later said medication had initially been prescribed to treat excruciating pain following reconstructive surgery on his scalp. Whether that moment alone created later dependence is debated, but it became part of a broader medical story in which pain, sleep, exhaustion, and pharmacological escape were no longer distant problems. They were entering the circuitry of his daily life. ABC News. Now place that fact beside the neuroscience of trauma and reward. Reviews of trauma's impact on the brain suggest that chronic early adversity can reshape the way the stress system and reward system interact, affecting alertness, motivation, emotional regulation, and vulnerability to later compulsive coping patterns. The person is not weak. The person is adapted to survive intensity, and survival adaptations do not always know when to stop. PMC, NCBI. This is where Michael Jackson's mystery becomes much sadder than people wanted it to be, because the evidence does not point to a monster or a cartoon eccentric. It points to a nervous system of astonishing power that may also have been chronically overtaxed. The child who learned to turn feeling into performance never got to stop performing long enough to become protected from feeling. The artist whose mind could build sound cathedrals out of breath and rhythm may have had no reliable way to quiet the machinery when the lights went out. And there is something almost unbearable in that image. The world saw the moonwalk, the glove, the lean, the impossible timing. It saw command. It saw domination. It saw someone who appeared almost superhuman in front of an audience. But a person can dominate a stage and still be helpless against his own mind at 3 a.m. A person can understand millions of people and still not understand how to live like one of them. That may be why Michael kept reaching for symbols of safety that others found childish or bizarre. Neverland was easy to mock, but harder to interpret honestly. It was not just fantasy branding, it looked more like a compensation system, a built environment designed around innocence, control, escape, and the recreation of experiences he had missed, a place where childhood could be staged because it had not been lived. That does not erase the controversies that surrounded him, and it should not. But it does complicate the emotional logic of the man. It suggests that behind the spectacle was someone trying to reverse a developmental theft. And this is the point where the title's promise starts to become clear. Scientists did not reveal that Michael Jackson had some alien brain, some magical lobe of genius, some freak anomaly visible under a microscope. What they revealed, when you assemble the evidence carefully, is something more profound. His brain appears to have been different in the way it was shaped and used, exceptionally tuned for music, movement, internal auditory imagery, and creative network integration. Exceptionally burdened by stress, deprivation, and the psychological costs of childhood fame. Extraordinary not because it escaped human biology, but because human biology, under extreme conditions, can produce brilliance and damage at the same time. But even that is not the final revelation. Because once you understand how his mind may have worked, another question rises that is even harder to answer. If Michael Jackson's brain was built for impossible sensitivity, then what did all that fame really do to it? What happens when the most finely tuned instrument in pop culture is also the one being hit the hardest? Part 4. By the time the world met the final version of Michael Jackson, the mystery had become almost impossible to untangle from the legend. There was the icon, frozen in image. There was the punchline, endlessly recycled by tabloids. There was the accused, the defended, the doubted, the worshipped, the mourned. And buried beneath all of those versions was the original human problem that may explain more than any rumor ever did. How do you survive inside a brain that can create beauty at that scale, while absorbing damage at that scale too? Because that is the discovery hidden inside all the science, all the testimony, all the memory, and all the misunderstanding. What made Michael Jackson's brain different from everyone else was not one single feature. It was a rare convergence. A mind trained from earliest childhood to process music with extreme depth, to convert sound into movement and anticipation with almost impossible fluency, and to generate internal musical worlds that others could only glimpse once he brought them outside himself. At the same time, it was a mind shaped by chronic pressure, deprivation, fear, scrutiny, and loneliness, so early that performance and protection became fused. His gift system and his survival system grew up together. That changes the story in a profound way. It means the same neurological conditions that helped make him magnetic may also have made him vulnerable. The same sensitivity that let him detect emotional nuance in rhythm, voice, and crowd energy may have left him unusually exposed to shame, pressure, overstimulation, and the inability to switch off. The same internal richness that gave birth to songs may have made ordinary life feel flat, chaotic, or unbearable, and the same discipline that allowed him to refine raw inspiration into history-making art may have made imperfection feel like danger rather than inconvenience. Suddenly, countless pieces of his life stopped looking random. His safety on stage, his fear off stage, his longing for childhood, his retreat into controlled worlds, his dependence on ritual, on environments he could shape, on medical intervention when natural rest would not come. None of this excuses every decision. None of it flattens the real controversies that followed him. But it does force a deeper honesty from history. Human beings are easier to judge when we insist on simple categories. Michael Jackson resists them because the evidence points to a man whose brilliance cannot be separated from the conditions that harmed him. Even his public transformations begin to look different under that light. The world obsessed over what he changed physically, but paid far less attention to why control might become so seductive for a person whose early life had offered so little of it. When a child grows up under scrutiny and punishment, then spends adulthood under global surveillance, control becomes more than preference. It becomes refuge, the face, the stage, the ranch, the sound, the schedule, the company kept around him, the sleep itself. All of it can become part of one huge project, to make inner chaos obey. But there is a terrible irony in that. The more control a person needs, the easier it is to be destroyed by the illusion of it. That is part of what makes Michael Jackson's end so devastating. The substances used around sleep were not just medical details. They were evidence of a deeper collapse in trust between body and mind. Sleep, the most basic surrender every human must make, had apparently become something he could no longer reach without intervention. For a person whose entire career was built on precision, that may have felt like the final humiliation, to be able to command rhythm before millions and yet not command rest alone in a room. That is why the final answer to the title is both extraordinary and sad. Scientists did not reveal that Michael Jackson was different because he was less human. They revealed, piece by piece, that he may have been more intensely human in certain systems than almost anyone around him, more sensitive to sound, more responsive to pattern, more able to bind movement to emotion, more driven to refine self-generated ideas into finished art, more vulnerable to the long afterlife of childhood stress, more dependent on structured environments to manage internal overload. In short, his brain may have been uniquely optimized for performance and uniquely endangered by the cost of sustaining it, and history may have misunderstood him for exactly that reason. People prefer geniuses who seem effortless, stable, and safely contained. Michael Jackson was none of those things. His art was effortless only to the audience. Inside the machine, the effort was total. His sensitivity was not decorative, it was the engine. And because the world consumed the product without protecting the person, it later treated the damage as evidence against the gift, instead of evidence of what the gift had endured. That may be the most haunting legacy of all. We celebrated the results of a brain we never truly tried to understand. We monetized its miracles, mocked its symptoms, sensationalized its pain, and then acted shocked when the whole structure became unsustainable. The public kept asking what was wrong with Michael Jackson, when a more honest question might have been what happened to him and what kind of mind had been carrying it all from the start. There is no neat ending to a story like that. There is no paragraph strong enough to cleanly separate wonder from loss. Michael Jackson remains too contested for that, too emotionally charged, too entangled with the culture that made and unmade him. But if the science has given us anything, it is a language more precise than gossip and kinder than myth. It allows us to see that his difference was real, just not in the way the tabloids suggested. The difference was in the extraordinary tuning of his creative systems and the extraordinary burden placed on them. And once you see that, the image of him changes forever. You no longer see only the glove, the spin, the scream, the silhouette, the face and the flashbulbs. You see the child under rehearsal. You see the adult still searching for the childhood that had been converted into labor. You see the artist hearing more than the room could hear. You see the performer using timing to reach inside millions of nervous systems because his own had been trained and strained with impossible intensity. You see a man who could make the world feel everything while spending much of his life trying to manage what he himself felt. So what made Michael Jackson's brain different from everyone else? Not one abnormality, not one rumor, not one scandal. It was the rare and devastating fusion of extreme musical neuroplasticity, relentless creative integration, and lifelong psychological overload. A brain that had been tuned for wonder and wounded by the conditions that created it. A brain capable of turning private sensitivity into public electricity. A brain that made him unlike anyone the world had seen, and perhaps left him unable to live like anyone else. And maybe that is why Michael Jackson still feels unresolved, even now, because beneath the fame, beneath the controversy, beneath the endless argument, there remains a more unsettling truth. The world did not just witness a superstar, it witnessed what can happen when an extraordinary human mind is sharpened beyond the ordinary limits of art, and then asked to survive the price of being unforgettable.